Hi, everybody. Welcome, and thank you for being here. Wanted to have another talk a little bit about financial purchases, but we're going to touch about a few things that we've kind of talked about throughout the year. For planning purposes, this will take about 20 to 30 minutes if you guys have something to go to afterwards. So I thought that the best way to kind of go over everything was kind of bring up situations that might arise and work through what might be the best way to handle it financially. So here's the first one. Case study 1. A 28-year-old first-year resident presents with headache, nausea, and restless sleep. Resident has been handed forms for his 401k program, option to invest in a Roth IRA account, and has an unopened email in his inbox with his loan payment reminder. I think that's a run-on sentence. Resident was advised by his parents to have a 6 months worth of salary and savings, and he has 2 months worth currently. So what this case is essentially trying to get to is if you have a little bit of extra money, where should you put it towards? So let's work through all of these different options and then get back to the main premise. So first, let's talk about retirement accounts and what they actually are. So you have options, two equivalent options, a 401k and a 403b. A 401k is what used to be pension plans. It used to be that employers would give you money into a fund, and at the end of when you retire, you would get a certain amount of money at the very end continuously. That's all been done away with, and there's no more pension plans. What is replaced that is 401k plans. So what an employer will do is that they will allow you, before you are taxed, to put some money into an account and allow you to invest that and grow that money for retirement. So kind of the general definition is a workplace savings that lets you invest a portion of your paycheck before the taxes come out. One of the best options or coolest things about a 401k is that sometimes they will match part of that money. So for example, if you had a paycheck for $1,000 and you put $100 into that, they might say, we're going to match that and put another $100 on top of that for you. Not every place does this, but this is some way for them to encourage retirement and to add benefits into it. A 403b is the exact same thing as a 401k. It just happens to be for nonprofit companies. So if you end up going to a hospital that is a nonprofit entity, they will offer you a 403b. Don't be confused by the terminology. It is essentially the exact same thing as a 401k. The other thing that we had talked about in that case study was you now have an option for a retirement account through your employer or a separate retirement account called a Roth IRA account. Personally, a Roth IRA account, I think, is the best retirement account that you can invest in. Here's why. If you wanted to put money into a retirement account, the benefit of doing so is based off of not being taxed on it. The difference between a traditional IRA account and a Roth IRA account is when you are taxed. So in a traditional IRA account, you don't pay taxes initially when you get that money and you put it into a retirement account, and then everything that you make on it get taxed at the very end. The Roth IRA is the exact opposite. You get the money after it's been taxed, you put it into a retirement account, you let it grow, and then whatever you have at the very end is yours to keep. You don't have to pay any taxes on it. So that is kind of the benefit of it, and it actually acts like a general investment platform. You can put that into any sort of fund or stock that you want to. The bad part about the Roth IRA account is that you're only allowed to put $5,000, about $5,000 a year into it every single year. And there's a cap after which you're not allowed to put into it. So if you make incomes more than $200,000, which generally most physicians are going to be making more than that amount, you're not allowed to use this account. So this is one of the best things that you can do when you're actually in residency. So just to kind of bring this point home, let's go through what the difference between traditional and a Roth IRA looks like. Say you have $5,000 that you've saved throughout the year. This is the gross amount that you've saved. If you were to put it into a traditional IRA account, that money would not be taxed. If you're trying to put it into a Roth IRA account, that money is taxed initially on that money that you make. So say it's taxed at a 20% rate. So the amount that actually goes into these accounts is $5,000 versus $4,000. Now let's say you're investing this amount of money every year while you're in residency. Say you're in a 5-year residency program starting at 30. So you do this from 30 to 35. You estimate that this money is going to grow 8% every year, which is a fairly conservative estimate, which we'll go over in a second. What do you have at 75? In a traditional IRA account, you have close to $700,000. In a Roth IRA account, you have about $550,000. Now remember, in the traditional IRA, you haven't paid taxes on it initially, so you have to pay that taxes on the end of what you've grown. In a Roth, you get to keep it. So say in a traditional IRA, now your tax bracket is actually higher because you've been making more money, not a resident salary. So your tax is now higher in the traditional IRA account. And at the end, you actually end up with $100,000 less. This is the biggest difference between a traditional IRA account and a Roth IRA account. At the end of the day, if you're putting money into any retirement account, that's fantastic. But if you're trying to get into the nitty-gritty details about which one you should be putting it into during residency, this might be able to help you out. Now that 8% interest, a lot of people have questions as to how I got to that number. If you were to look at the general market over a long period of time, there has never been a 30-year stretch where the S&P 500 has made less than 9% every year after year. Never in its entirety. That includes the Great Depression, includes the Great Recession. If you were to take 1928 to 2014, the S&P year over year makes 9.6%. If you were to take a shorter period, 1965 to 2014, it would be 9.8%. If you were to take an even shorter period of time and include the Great Recession in 2007, 2008, you would have still made 7.6%. The thing that you have to keep in mind is when you're thinking about retiring. If you were in 2005 thinking about retiring in 5 years, in 2009, you would have lost 6% every single year if you had kept your money just in stocks. That would have meant that you would have lost a quarter of your investment. So if you had that $500,000, you would have lost more than $100,000 at the very end. So you want to make sure that you're transitioning in your retirement closer to safer investments as you get older and older. Question that I get a lot is, I'm thinking about doing all this. What do I actually need in order to start investing? This is it. You need either a Social Security or tax ID, a driver's license, address, employment status, annual income, and date of birth. That's what's asked for in order to open up an account. So you can all do this currently. You can all do it as soon as you're starting residency. Whenever you want to, it would be completely feasible to do. Where should you do it? You have tons of options. These are a couple of listed as the best online brokers for beginners. Every time you make a trade, it costs a little bit of money. And some of these accounts don't require you to have a ton of money in them. For example, a TD Ameritrade, you don't need to have any sort of minimum amount in that platform in order to start trading. You can put $100 in and start investing a little bit just to get your feet wet. The best online brokers, if you're looking to do a little bit more research, these are some of the ones that you might consider. All of these, the same exact thing, you need those 6 options. In the same exact way, all of these funds allow you to open up a Roth IRA or a traditional IRA account that is linked directly to these brokerages. So you can put money in and then and have all of it in one place for you to invest it. Okay, so we kind of went through all of these different options, what everything means. Let's get back to our case study. So now you have a little bit of extra money. You have the opportunity to do your hospital 401k program, a Roth IRA account, your loan repayment, and should you have some money saved up as a just because. Here's kind of the hierarchy. If you have $500 of extra savings, you have 3 essential options. You either pay down debt, you put it towards investing, or of course you kind of do a mix, a little bit of both. So what's the best option for you? What sort of debt should you pay down before you do anything else? High interest debt, any debt that's above 10%. Normally, this is credit card debt. If you have any money that's accruing on your credit card, you should pay that off first. The non-financial answer to this is if you are somebody who likes to not have debt on their balance sheet, doesn't like to think about the debt accruing, then you can pay it down. Financially, it doesn't necessarily always make sense to pay off your debt first. When should you invest early? This is one of those times where you should. If your debt is under 5%, the interest on it is under 5%, it makes more financial sense to not pay down debt if you have extra money and to invest it instead. for the reason we talked about earlier. Year over year, you're guaranteed, if you're investing for a long period of time, to make 8 to 9% in the general market. So you'll make more money by investing it rather than paying down the debt that's accruing at 5% interest. And then the hybrid mix, which is generally what most people will fall under, invest first into the tax savings account plans. Those allow you to save an extra 20, 30% more than you would on the value of that dollar because you don't have to pay taxes on it. And then after that, go down and pay some additional debt that you have accruing. That's probably kind of the hierarchy of what you would need to do. This idea of 6 months of savings. General principle, people will say if you're making money or if you're in a job, you should always have 6 months of savings as a just because. One of the things that I always talk about is our financial situations as medical students, residents, and physicians is going to be different than the average person who's in an average job. It is almost unheard of for a resident to lose their job. The one situation that was different, I don't know if anybody had seen this, but about 4 years ago, there was this neurology resident down in Florida, and she was videotaped harassing an Uber driver. She was falling drunk, she threw things out of his door. She had to appear on Good Morning America and issue an apology on camera. You know what happened to her? She kept her job. She stayed as resident at this place. It is so hard to get to fire a resident that you don't really necessarily need to have 6 months of savings. You are in a very stable profession. You don't need to worry about that firing when the next recession actually happens. So one of the things that you should keep in mind is if you do have that extra money, do you need to keep it as a rainy day fund? Probably not, unless you think you might need some car repairs or something in that future. But just in terms of job security, you're in a very stable and safe position. So don't buy into the general advice of needing 6 months of savings. You can do more with that money. Okay, before the next case study, any questions on that one? Yeah.
We're setting up the accounts in we're students and we don't really have an income. How does that affect setting up the investment accounts?
It's fine. You can put no income. You're allowed to put the income that you get from your loans as the income that you have. Yep.
Any suggestions for having more liquid investments? You say you don't need a 6 month emergency fund, but if your car does break down, you have a multi-$1,000 expense.
Right.
Any suggestions for more liquid investments?
Yep. So a couple of very liquid things that you can do. So stocks are very liquid. You can sell them all off, and you can have that money within a couple of days. A very safe one that you can do is buying into U.S. Treasuries. So U.S. Treasuries are noted as 30-day investments, 60-day investments, and 90-day investments, and they offer you some form of return. It's nothing major, but you'll still make some money, and you're guaranteed to have that money back within that month. That's something that you can do. Yep.
So if you have a 401k and a 403b, is it recommended to consolidate them, or is it okay to just leave them as is?
So if you're at a particular employer, say you're working at Beth Israel, while you're at Beth Israel, you need to keep the money in that company's fund. Once you leave that residency or leave that company, you're allowed to take that money and roll it into a consolidated plan. So if you've worked at 3 different places, you're allowed to put all of that together under one umbrella. The reason why 403b and 401k is nomenclature different is only based on where you're working. Once you're done there, you can put it together in one tax benefit account. Yeah.
Can you have more than one Roth IRA?
You can. It wouldn't necessarily, you can in the sense that you want to put $2,000 into this account and $2,000 into that account, that's absolutely fine. But you're still overall maxed out at $5,000. It wouldn't benefit you in any sort of way. You can still take those $2,000 and invest it differently in one account. Great. All right. Scenario 2. 30-year-old resident is finishing her residency and about to start her fellowship. Up until now, she and her partner have been renting a home, but now they want to buy a home, especially with a kid on the way. She and her partner are worried about throwing money away renting. Both recently applied for a joint credit card with a limit of $1,000, which they reach about $850 every month for their expenses. So renting and buying a home. This is going to be what probably the largest financial purchase that you'll have to consider in your lifetime. Why this is important and why this last line about what their credit card limit and how much they're putting on it has been included has to do with your credit score. So kind of as a recap, your credit score is a number somewhere between 400 and 800 that tells issuers of mortgages, for example, how risky you are. If your number is closer to 800, that means that you are not risky, and they're willing to give you money at a very low interest rate. If your number is closer to 400, that means that you are risky, and they're going to charge you more because they don't trust that you can pay something back in time. Here's an example of that. Say you're trying to buy a $300,000 house in Rhode Island. If your credit score is in the highest tier between 760 and 850 versus not even low but mediocre from 620 to 640, you're going to end up paying an extra $100,000 in interest based on your credit score. So the first thing you need to do when you're deciding if you're trying to rent or buy a house is figure out what your credit score is. If your credit score is not above $700, it almost never makes sense to buy a house just because of the interest that you're going to have to pay on that house. How do you figure out what your credit score is and how do you improve your credit score? Figuring out your credit score at this point has become very common. You'll have Credit Karma. Most credit card companies allow you to pull your credit report. You're allowed once a year to pull your credit reports from all 3 financial agencies for free, so that you can just go online and do it very quickly. The harder part is trying to actually build up your credit score. How do you become less risky? So if you're trying to figure out what your credit score is or how to make it better, there are 5 components that actually make up your credit score. The first one is one that everybody knows about and is pretty easy to do, and that's paying your debt off in time. So your student loans, your credit cards, when it's due, actually pay it. The unfortunate thing about this is if you are great at that, if you pay everything off on time, like this couple in our scenario does, that only helps you 35% of the way. That's all that helps you in your credit score. The second and almost equally important scenario or component to this, which is the one that gets messed up the most, is something called your utilization rate. So utilization rate talks about how much of your credit you are actually using up. If you have a $1,000 credit limit and you put $500 on it every single month, you are utilizing 50% of your credit. Our couple here was utilizing 85% of their credit because they have a $1,000 limit and they're putting $850 on it. If you want to be in the top bracket credit score, you need to be utilizing less than 15% every single time, every single month. So there are 2 ways of going about this. You either decrease your numerator or increase your denominator. You can change your expenses so you're putting a lot less in your credit card and putting it on your debit card or paying in cash. That isn't advisable because credit cards are great. They allow you for every purchase to get something back in return, so points or cash back, whatever it is. What I suggest is that you actually increase your denominator. It's very easy to call your bank or your credit card company and say, I've been using your credit card over the last year and I pay off everything in time. I'm a good customer, but this is affecting my credit score. Can I, instead of having a $1,000 limit, have a $2,000 limit? And they'll say, sure, no problem. And then in 3 months, you'll call again and be like, can I have $4,000? They'll be like, no problem. And then in 3 months, you'll call again and say, can I have $8,000? And they'll say, no problem. Keep calling them until your denominator is whatever it is, $20,000, and whatever your expenses are going to be less than 10 to 15% of your utilization rate. That's the fastest and most efficient way to build up your credit score. The last 3, length of history. If you opened up a credit card in college, keep it going. They like to see that you can have one piece of credit for a long period of time. If that credit card isn't a great credit card, doesn't give you great points, my suggestion is put one recurring monthly item on it. Put your Netflix account or your New York Times on it and have that paid off once a month very simply in the background. In that same sort of way, don't constantly open up new credit cards. If you're going to Banana Republic and they offer you 10% off on your order for a new credit card, don't do it. Don't constantly be opening up new credit cards. That shows that you're risky and are willing to take on more debt. and it will decrease your credit card. And the last one usually isn't an issue for most medical students because we have a variety of debt, but types of credit usually helps you. So having credit cards, cars, student loans, all the different aspects of it shows that you're willing and able to cover a variety of different costs. Again, this is the huge breakdown. You're trying to get to that. If you were able to do the top two really well, you can be in the top bracket of credit score and be able to get a great interest rate on your house. Okay, so now that we've actually done this, what about actually renting versus buying? Cost of renting is fairly cheap. You have to pay the rent, and then if you want it, you have to buy renter's insurance. This is different from cars, which we're going to get to, where owning and leasing is very similar in terms of cost. Owning versus renting and housing, it's very different. If you're owning a house, you have the monthly mortgage, you have interest payments, you have the property tax and insurance, you have to pay the maintenance and repairs, and once you sell the cost, you are liable for all the costs associated with selling it. So if you're renting and the dishwasher breaks down, you're not the one who actually has to pay for it. The landlord or the person who owns the property does. If you're the owner, all those costs are on you. So why is this going to be important? If you're trying to sell your home, you're going to have to incur all of those costs at the end of when you're trying to sell it. Again, our path as physicians is going to be slightly different than the average person. It is generally said that if you're trying to break even or actually benefit from having a home, you want to stay in that home for 10 years. That's kind of a arbitrary rule, but a good kind of general rule out there. With residency, fellowship, and our opportunities to move to different locations, especially in the beginning, chances are we're not going to stay in one location for 10 years. If you feel like you are, if you're a lifer of Rhode Islander, going to stay here for residency and for fellowship, and you're going to be here forever, getting a house might actually make financial sense for you. But if you're going to be someone who's going from one position to another in different states, renting actually comes out up ahead. And the last thing that I'll try to plug in is a personal preference of mine. I don't particularly think a house is an investment. It's a place that you're living. And if it's a place that you're thinking that you're going to put money into and then in 10 years you're going to want to sell it, I think there's an underestimation of the emotional impact of moving places and building a house into a home is. This is a great resource, something that works really well. It allows you to put in a home price for you and what renting is in that location and tells you over how many years it would take in order for you to benefit from having a home versus buying. It's on realtor.com. Okay, questions about, yes?
So I interviewed for a residency program that's 5 years, and pretty much I would say like 80% of the residents I met around the country all bought houses and were saying that they were told like 5 years is the number, and so that's why everyone did it.
Yeah.
Is that not so true?
It very well could be, and a lot of it is geographically located. Some places are going to be super cheap to buy a house, and it might make financial sense. And if the housing market doesn't actually, or if the house doesn't cost that much, then at the end when you're selling it, you don't need to pay as much. But the reason why the 10 years is a better estimate, or I personally think it's a better estimate, is because the amount of money that you have to pay to actually sell the house cuts down a lot of the profit that you make if you haven't extended it long enough in that time period, if that makes sense. Yeah?
What about like down payments for doctors on houses?
It's a good question. So there are a lot of programs out there, especially government-backed, where if it's your first house, you can have a very low down payment. You don't have to kind of match that 20%. They allow you to do, if it's your first house that you're buying, they can let you in at like a 5% rate. Some residency programs also they do this more for renting than they do for obviously a down payment. But if an apartment complex requires you to put a down payment or the first month rent on, the residency program will guarantee your that portion for you before you start the residency. It depends on the program.
Can you talk a little bit more about mortgages and their tax benefits as well?
Yeah, so they do have great tax benefits. It's kind of in the same way that we talked about 401k and 403b, it's a way to kind of offset some of the taxes that you have to pay. So if you are paying a $1,000 mortgage, you're allowed to put that as an expense when you're paying your taxes at the very end. So it decreases the amount of taxes that you have to pay. So if you have $10,000 that you're making and you have a $1,000 mortgage, you're allowed to say that my income is only $9,000, so you're only paying taxes on $9,000 instead of $10,000.
So say if you had an over $200,000 income, is there any intersection as to what your mortgage should be that is most, I guess, financially beneficial for you?
Yeah, so a lot of that is going to depend on what your general expenses are. And there are great calculators that you can, if you were to type in on Google, what cost of home can I buy, whatever that is, they'll tell you, put your zip code in, put in your income, put in your expenses. This is about how much you can afford in terms of housing. It's a fairly simple calculation, but it's easier when you don't need to do it and they kind of put the inputs for you and you can kind of look at the affordability range that way. Great. Okay, number 3. First-year medical student presents with fatigue and edema. He has been walking from his apartment to school and his mentoring site. PCP has recommended getting a car, and student has been going to several dealerships to try and lease a car for his remaining 3 years here. He plans on moving back to New York City for residency and does not anticipate needing a car at that point. So the question of buying versus leasing a car. The big question is, should I lease a car? The answer to that is no. In almost every financial situation, leasing a car does not make sense. The one caveat to that I would state is if you think that you will not need a car again in a couple of years, like this person would, then it might make sense for you to have a car for a few years and then not need to worry about selling it, but just giving that car back at that point. Again, our situations are very fluid. You might think you're going to New York City and end up in Kansas and need a car. In that case, when you're signing a lease for a car, you should always make sure and tell the dealership that you want the option of buying the car at the end. So the amount of money that you've put into leasing it deducts from the cost of the car, and then you can just purchase it at the very end. We talked a little bit about, when we were talking about buying versus renting a house, the difference between buying versus renting. Leasing versus buying a car is essentially the same in terms of what you need to pay. So if you think about the out-of-pocket expenses in buying a car, there's 5, 6 essential things: fuel, state fees, insurance, financing, repairs, and maintenance. You're responsible for all of that, obviously, when you're buying a car. On top of that, you have to think about what value of the car is being lost over the time period that you're going to be owning it, let's say for 5 years. So let's take 2 fairly equivalent cars, the 2016 Honda CR-V and the 2016 Mazda CX-5. If you look at the out-of-pocket expenses for both of these cars, they are nearly identical. The difference in the cost of owning this car is what happens in 5 years. For whatever reason, our society has determined that a Honda is more valuable than a Mazda in 5 years. So the Honda depreciates $14,000 versus the Mazda depreciating $17,000. So when you're selling that car at the end, your cost is higher on the Mazda than the Honda because you're not recuperating that money at the very end. This information you can find in something called the Kelley Blue Book. They'll go through every car and tell you what the expected value is going to be now and in the future for every single car. And the one thing, again, when you're talking about all of these expenses, the reason why financial or leasing a car almost never makes sense is because you have to pay all of these costs, whether you're the owner or the leaser. Whereas in a house, if something breaks down, the owner buys it. If you're leasing a car, if something breaks down, you're still the one liable for the repairs. All right, buying versus leasing car, any questions there? That one's usually a fairly straightforward one. All right, last one. 4th-year medical student has been dating his partner for the last several years. On match day, he proposes to his partner. What a match! They begin to plan the wedding and are putting together their guest list. With family and all the wonderful med school friends they have made, the final head count is 150. They decide to have their wedding in a few months before residency begins. They try and figure out how much money it will cost them. So, Medical students are in debt. When asked about how they will pay their wedding, the answers are usually, my wedding won't be expensive, it will be small and elegant. I'll figure it out once I'm engaged, I'm not even dating anyone right now. Or I think my parents will help me out, or she will make her parents help me, or maybe I'll take out a loan. What's one more loan anyway? So these answers obviously aren't great. And while I'm using wedding here, think of this as any sort of big financial purchase that you might have in your future. So, oh crap, weddings are really expensive. Weddings across America, the average cost is around $33,000. Let's look at cities that we're closer to. So Rhode Island, $50,000 for a wedding. New York City, $83,000 for an average wedding. Chicago, $62,000, $61,000 for an average wedding. So yes, weddings are very expensive. How do I save for a wedding? So if the average wedding cost is $32,000, if you were to save for just the time period of an average engagement, which is 14 months, you would have to save over $2,000 each month in order to pay for that. If you were very frugal or maybe engaged for a very long period of time, for 60 months, you'd have to save about $500 every single month in order to pay for it. Why weddings are really expensive? Fixed costs are the issue. You can change the number of people from 150 to 100, but you're still going to have to pay for a venue, which is about $15,000, a photographer, a band, a DJ, florist, a wedding dress, oh yeah, and that engagement ring. That's about average cost of $5,000. So if you're thinking about a wedding, who actually pays for it? Well, this is the breakdown that was, I think, 2 years ago. For whatever reason, bride's parents end up paying 44% of the cost. 43% are the actual couple. Groom's parents are 12%, and I don't know what the other is. My guess is Kickstarter is 1%. So that makes you responsible for $14K. So if the couple's responsible for $14K, how much do you need to save? Well, for 14 months, you would have to save $1,000. For 60 months, $233. Maybe a little bit more feasible. Obviously, the big thing here is the longer you think about these things and plan for them, the more feasible it is to actually save that money month over month. Where should that money go? Well, the way that we want to end this is kind of talking about what you should be actually doing with your money, which is this hierarchy. If you have initial savings, you need to figure out what mix is best for you between paying down high interest debt, tax benefit savings, and then having that additional savings. Personally, I always think that putting money into tax deferred investment accounts is the best way that you can add your money for retirement, pay off any sort of debt, and always keep in mind any sort of big purchases that you might have in the future and have that fund going or some money trickling down into that fund. Okay, that's quick and dirty big purchases. Thank you, and any questions, happy to take them.